It was one of those flights where everything felt rushed from the very beginning. The kind where you are still catching your breath from running through the terminal. Your boarding pass is crumpled in your hand, and you are just praying your seat is not in the middle of a row. That was exactly the situation Marisol found herself in that evening at Dubai International Airport, dragging a worn-out carry-on bag with one hand and holding her 7-year-old daughter Lucia's hand with the other. She had been awake since 4 in the morning. She had not eaten a proper meal since the day before, and the only thing keeping her moving was the thought of what was waiting for her in New York, a second interview at a hotel company. The kind of opportunity she had been quietly working toward for the better part of 2 years. She was not flying business class. She was not flying with extra legroom. She was in seat 14B, the middle seat, sandwiched between the window and the aisle. And she was perfectly fine with that because at least she and Lucia were together. She tucked her daughter in close, pulled out a small coloring book she had bought from an airport kiosk for $3, and let out a long, slow breath. They were on the plane. They were okay. That was enough. A few rows up, however, things were a very different story. Conrad Ellison, a man who had built a logistics and technology empire across 9 countries over 30 years, was seated in 1/4 of the window seat right next to her, and he was furious. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in that cold and quiet way that rich men get when the world fails to operate the way they expect it to. His private jet had been double-booked by his own assistant. A mistake so basic it had genuinely stunned him, and now here he was, sitting in economy class on a commercial flight for the first time in over a decade, staring at the headrest in front of him like it had personally offended him. He unfolded a newspaper, held it up like a wall, and made it very clear, without saying a single word, that he had no interest in talking to anyone. Marisol noticed him, glanced over once, and then turned back to Lucia. She had dealt with men like that her whole life. She knew when someone wanted to be left alone, and she was tired anyway. So the first hour of that 14-hour flight from Dubai to New York passed quietly enough. Lucia colored. Marisol dozed with her head resting against her daughter's. Conrad read his newspaper and ordered a whiskey. And then, somewhere around the first hour and 20 minutes into the flight, everything changed. It started with a voice, a flight attendant speaking loudly and clearly over the general hum of the cabin, trying to stay calm but not quite managing it. There was a medical situation in row 22. A passenger was in distress, clutching his chest, breathing in short, shallow bursts. And he was frightened and confused, and not a single person around him could understand what he was saying because he was speaking Mandarin and speaking it fast. The flight attendants were doing their best, pointing, miming, showing him things, but it was not working, and the man's fear was growing with every second that passed. Marisol was on her feet before she even made the conscious decision to stand. She handed Lucia her juice box, told her to stay put, and walked calmly to row 22. She crouched beside the man, spoke to him directly in Mandarin, not slowly, not loudly, just naturally, the way you speak to someone you want to reassure. And within about 40 seconds, the man's breathing had slowed down. He was not having a heart attack. He was having a panic attack, his first one ever, triggered by turbulence earlier in the flight and made 10 times worse by the isolation of not being able to communicate. Marisol spoke with him for another couple of minutes, translated everything to the flight attendant beside her, helped get him water and a blanket, and then walked back to her seat. She sat down, picked up her own juice box from Lucia's little hand, and took a sip. The whole thing had taken maybe 4 minutes. Conrad had lowered his newspaper exactly 1 inch. He had not meant to watch, but he had watched every second of it. And something about the way she had done it, no fuss, no performance, no waiting to be asked, had caught his attention in a way He was not entirely prepared for Dot. The thing about a long flight is that once people see someone helping, really helping, the word travels through the cabin faster than the drink cart does. Within the next 30 minutes, a flight attendant appeared at Marisol's row again, apologetic, a little awkward about it, and explained that there was an elderly couple near the back who were extremely upset, and nobody could figure out why. Marisol looked at Lucia, who had moved on from her coloring book to drawing little animals on a napkin, kissed the top of her head, and got up again. The couple was Polish, in their late 70s, and they were not upset about anything dangerous. They were upset because their checked luggage had been tagged to a connecting flight they had not realized they were on, and the confusion had been building in their heads for the last hour until it turned into genuine distress. The woman was crying quietly. The man kept showing his ticket to anyone who would look, and neither of them had slept properly in what appeared to be a very long time. Marisol sat with them for about 10 minutes, spoke to them in Polish, sorted through the actual logistics of their situation with the flight attendant, and by the time she left them, they were calm, had been given a printed note to show customs, and the woman had patted Marisol's hand 3 times like she was a grandchild who had shown up at exactly the right moment. Marisol smiled, walked back down the aisle, and had barely settled into her seat when a different flight attendant, a younger one this time, clearly relieved someone on board actually knew what they were doing, leaned over and asked in a low voice if she happened to speak any French. A university student in row 31 was having a panic attack, real and escalating, and she could not explain what she needed or where her medication was because every time someone tried to talk to her in English, it seemed to make things worse. So Marisol got up a 3rd time. Lucia, without even looking up from her napkin drawing, handed her mother the last of the pretzels like she had done this kind of thing 100 times before, which, in small ways, she had. The student was maybe 19 or 20, traveling alone for the first time, and she had worked herself into a spiral somewhere over the Arabian Sea. Marisol pulled a spare seat from across the aisle, sat right beside her, and just talked, quietly. In French, nothing complicated, just steady and calm and present, until the girl's breathing leveled out and her hands stopped shaking. She helped her find her medication in her backpack, stayed until she had taken it, and then arranged with the crew to check on her every 20 minutes for the rest of the flight. By this point, Conrad had put the newspaper down completely. He was not even pretending anymore. He watched Marisol walk back down the aisle for the 3rd time, watched the way other passengers tracked her with their eyes, not in a nosy way, but in the way people look at someone who makes them feel safer just by being in the room. And he felt something he did not have a ready word for, which was unusual for him because he almost always had a ready word for everything. Over the following hour and a half, a German businessman came to find her about a customs document he could not read. 2 Japanese tourists in their 60s needed help locating their connection details, which had been sent to them in email they could not navigate. And a woman 3 rows back needed someone to help her explain to the crew that her baby had developed a rash, and she needed to know if there was anything on board that could help. She spoke Tagalog and almost no English at all, and she had been trying to communicate this for 40 minutes by the time Marisol reached her. Marisol handled every single one of them. German, Japanese, Tagalog, and when the gentleman in 22 called her back over because he had a follow-up question he had been too embarrassed to ask the first time, she handled that in Mandarin again too, this time with a small laugh that made him laugh as well, which was something nobody had managed to get out of him the entire flight. Through all of it, Lucia sat in 1-4B, drawing her animals, occasionally holding her mother's seat like a tiny professional assistant. And Conrad, who had spent 30 years building a company on the idea that the right person in the right role could change everything, sat in 14A, and quietly began to understand that he was sitting next to someone extraordinary, someone who had no idea he was thinking then, and honestly would not have cared either way. It was somewhere over the Atlantic. With about 5 hours left in the flight, and the cabin lights dimmed to that soft bluish glow that makes everyone look a little tired and a little more honest, that Conrad finally spoke. Not loudly, not with any of the authority he typically carried into rooms, but in the careful way a person speaks when they are genuinely curious about something and do not want to accidentally ruin it by coming across the wrong way. He folded the newspaper he had long since stopped reading, set it on the tray table, and turned slightly in his seat toward Marisol, who was eating her second little bag of pretzels and watching Lucia sleep against her shoulder with that particular kind of quietness that mothers have when their child is finally resting and they do not want to disturb a single thing. He asked her where she had learned to speak like that. All of it, all those languages, that fluently, that naturally. And Marisol glanced at him for a second like she was deciding how much of an answer the question actually deserved, because she had been asked versions of it before, and the conversation that followed was usually either impressed in an exhausting way or dismissive in an even more exhausting way. But something about the way he asked it, without the performance, without the wide eyes, made her give him a real answer. She told him the short version first. The way you do with strangers. Born in the Philippines, grew up partly in Saudi Arabia. Went to a school run by French and Spanish-speaking nuns who treated language like a form of discipline. Then spent her 20s moving. Tokyo for 3 years working in a hotel. Berlin for 2 more. Dubai for the longest stretch, almost 6 years, where she had picked up enough Arabic to get through anything that mattered. She had not set out to collect languages, she explained. She had just kept ending up in places where not speaking meant not surviving, and she had always preferred surviving. Conrad listened to all of it without interrupting, which she noticed because most people interrupted. Then he asked the question that was actually underneath all the other questions, the one he had been circling since row 22, which was what she did for work. She told him. A mid-level coordination role she was interviewing for at a hotel company in New York. The kind of job that came with a modest salary and a desk and the quiet relief of finally having something stable, enough to build a life around for her and Lucia. She said it plainly, without embarrassment and without apology. The way someone speaks about their life when they have done the hard work of making peace with where they are while still wanting more. Conrad was quiet for a moment. Then he reached forward, picked up the paper napkin from his tray table, the one his whiskey glass had been sitting on, and held out his hand toward the flight attendant passing by, asking her, somewhat awkwardly for a man clearly used to having things handed to him, if she had a pen. The flight attendant looked mildly amused and produced one from her apron. Conrad wrote something on the napkin. He did not show it to Marisol right away. He held it for a second like he was reconsidering, and then he slid it across the tray table and left his hand there for just a moment before pulling it back, in the way people do when they have just done something they cannot take back and I'm not entirely sure they want to. Marisol looked down at the napkin. There was a number written on it, not a phone number, a salary figure, and underneath it, 2 lines. A title, and a company name. Director of Global Client Relations, Ellison Global. She read it twice. Then she looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite amusement, but something sitting right between the two. And she said, with complete seriousness, "Is this a joke?" He told her it was not. He told her, in the straightforward way he spoke about everything related to his company, that he ran 14 offices across 9 countries and spent more money than he liked to think about on translators and cultural liaison teams and miscommunications that turned into missed deals and broken relationships in markets that required exactly the kind of fluency, and instinct she had demonstrated quietly and without any fuss over the past 4 hours at 30,000 feet. He told her she had done more in that cabin than his entire international communications department had managed during a disastrous quarter in Southeast Asia that had cost him considerably more than a napkin. Marisol looked at the number again. Then she looked at Lucia sleeping against her shoulder, small and warm and completely unaware that the conversation happening 2 inches above her head might be about to change both of their lives. And then Marisol did something Conrad had not expected at all. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She folded the napkin carefully in half, tucked it into her jacket pocket, and asked him one single question. Does your company's health plan cover single-parent households? The plane landed at JFK just after 6 in the morning. That gray and quiet hour when the city is not quite awake yet and everything feels a little unreal. And Marisol stepped off flight with Lucia on her hip, a crumpled napkin in her jacket pocket, and a head full of thoughts she did not yet know what to do with. Conrad had given her his direct contact before they parted ways at the gate, not his assistant's number, his own, and had told her his team would send over a formal offer within 48 hours. Said it with the kind of calm confidence that comes from being a man who is rarely told no. Marisol had nodded, thanked him, and then watched him disappear into the terminal with 2 people who had appeared out of nowhere to collect him. And she had stood there for a moment in the middle of the crowd, with Lucia tugging her sleeve, asking if they could get a bagel. And she had thought very clearly and very simply, do not let that number make you stupid. She went to her original interview that same afternoon. She had ironed her blouse in the hotel bathroom. She had practiced her answers in the mirror while Lucia watched cartoons on the bed. And she had walked into that hotel company's office and sat across from 2 people who spent 40 minutes asking her questions she could answer in her sleep. They offered her the job before she left the building. She smiled, shook their hands, and turned it down in the elevator on the way out, politely and without drama, because she already knew that chapter was not the one she was supposed to be in. But saying no to the smaller thing did not mean she was ready to say yes to the bigger one. Not yet. Not without doing what she had always done before making any decision that affected her and Lucia. She did her homework. She spent the next 3 days researching Conrad Ellison and Ellison Global, the way she used to research cities before she moved to them, thoroughly and without rose-tinted glasses, looking not just for what was impressive, but for what people said when they were no longer trying to be polite about it. What she found was not simple. The company was genuinely successful. That part was easy to confirm. 14 offices, strong revenues, a reputation in logistics and technology that was hard-earned and real. But the other things were harder to sit with. There were 2 former employees who had spoken publicly about the culture inside the company, not dramatically, not with any obvious bitterness, just factually, and both of them described a place that rewarded results without much regard for the people producing them. One of them, a woman who had held a senior role for almost 3 years, had written about it in a personal essay that Marisol found through a forum thread. And the phrase that stayed with her was this: it is a place that will take everything you have and call it an opportunity. She read that line twice and then closed her laptop and sat with it for a while. She talked to her sister back home, who told her to pray about it and also to ask for more money, which was the most useful combination of advice anyone gave her that week. She talked to a woman from her church who had spent 20 years in corporate human resources and who sat across from her at a small table with 2 cups of tea and listened carefully and then said, "The offer is not the whole story. Find out who has the power to change the terms after you sign." And she thought about Lucia, who was currently asleep in the next room, and who needed stability more than she needed anything else, and who had already moved schools twice and countries 3 times before the age of 7 and deserved, more than anything, a version of her mother that was not exhausted and afraid. So Marisol did not call Conrad. She did not email him either. What she did instead was sit down at the small hotel desk with a notepad and write out, carefully and without rushing, a list of everything she needed the role to actually be in order for her to say yes to it, not just the salary figure on the napkin, but the real things, the ones that would determine whether this was genuinely a new beginning or just a shinier version of being undervalued. Remote flexibility for school pickups and sick days. A written scope of her authority that could not be quietly reduced after 6 months. A clause protecting her position from being restructured without cause or proper notice. And one more thing, the one she added last and underlined once. A direct line to Conrad himself. Not a chain of assistants, not a department head. Him, because she had learned a long time ago that in any arrangement where the power is unequal, the only thing that actually protects you is access. She typed it all up cleanly, added a single line at the top that said, "I am not looking for a job. I am looking for a partnership, and if that is not what this is, then I am grateful for the napkin." And she sent it at 11:43 on a Tuesday night to the legal email address his assistant had included in the formal offer. And then she closed her laptop, checked on Lucia, and went to sleep without knowing what would come next, which was, she had decided, exactly the right way to do it. The silence that followed that email was 36 hours long, and Marisol felt every single one of them. Not in a panicked way, not in the way she might have felt at 10 years younger, when she still believed that waiting meant something was going wrong, but in the steady and slightly exhausting way of a person who has made a decision they believe in and now has to sit with the uncertainty of whether the other person will meet them there. She took Lucia to Central Park on the first day. She bought them both hot chocolate from a cart near the entrance, found a bench facing the water, and watched her daughter run toward a group of pigeons with absolutely no plan and complete commitment. And she thought about how much of her own life had looked exactly like that, running towards something with no guarantee it would work out, just a decision to move. On the second day, she cleaned the hotel room, even though housekeeping had already done it, which was what she did when her hands needed something to do while her mind was elsewhere. And then on the evening of the second day, her phone buzzed with an email from Conrad's legal team, and the subject line was 4 words. Terms accepted in full. Every clause. The flexibility, the written scope, the restructuring protection, the direct line. All of it, signed and formatted and attached as a proper document. And at the very bottom of the email, below all the formal language, was a single line that had clearly been added by Conrad himself, because it did not sound like any lawyer had written it. It said, "For what it's worth, nobody has ever responded to one of my offers with a question about benefits before. And I think that says everything about why I want you on my team." Marisol read that line and laughed out loud, alone in the hotel room while Lucia slept, the kind of laugh that is really just relief finding its way out. She started at Ellison Global 6 weeks later, and what followed over the next 3 years was not a fairy tale. It is important to say that clearly, because real life does not work that way, and this story has always been a real one. There were hard weeks and frustrating months and moments where she sat in meetings in cities she had never visited and felt the particular loneliness of being the only person in the room who had ever had to think carefully before spending $40. There were people inside the company who underestimated her quietly, the way people do when they cannot reconcile what they assumed with what they are seeing. And she handled each of those situations the same way she had handled everything else in her life, directly, without making it a bigger moment than it needed to be. And then she got back to work. And the work was remarkable. Within her first year, she had rebuilt the entire international communication structure of a company that had been held together in that department, largely by expensive contractors and good intentions. She brought in multilingual staff from immigrant communities, people who carried the same kind of hard-earned fluency she did, the kind that comes from living inside a language rather than studying it. And she built a cultural liaison protocol so thorough and so practical that 2 separate Fortune 500 companies licensed it within 18 months of its completion. She closed a deal in Southeast Asia in her 2nd year that 3 previous delegations had failed to get across the line, not because she was louder or more aggressive than the people before her, but because she understood that the people on the other side of the table needed to feel genuinely respected before they would ever feel genuinely ready. And she knew how to make them feel that because she had spent most of her life needing exactly the same thing. Conrad became a different kind of employer during those years. Not dramatically, not with any grand announcement, but in the gradual and real way that people change when someone they respect shows them a better way to see something. He would say in later interviews that she had not just changed his company. She had changed how he thought about the word potential, about where it lives and what it looks like and how often he had walked right past it in his life, because it had not been wearing the right clothes or sitting in the right seat. As for Lucia, she grew up watching all of it, watching her mother fly to 9 countries, negotiate with people 3 times her age, build something real from a conversation that started over a bag of airport pretzels at 30,000 feet. And when she was asked years later by a school counselor what her mother had taught her, she thought about it for a moment and then said, "She taught me to always ask about the benefits," which was funny, and also, if you knew the whole story, the truest thing anyone could have said.
Thanks for watching my video. Like, subscribe and share.